The First Liberian Civil War was an internal conflict in Liberia from 1989 until 1997. The conflict killed over 200,000 people and eventually led to the involvement of the Economic Community of West African States and of the United Nations. The peace did not last long, and in 1999 the Second Liberian Civil War broke out. Samuel Doe had led a coup d'état copyright act that overthrew the elected government in 1980, and in 1985 held elections that were widely considered fraudulent. There had been one unsuccessful coup by a former military leader. In December 1989, former government minister Charles Taylor moved into the country from neighboring Côte to start an uprising meant to topple the Doe government. During the Civil War, factions formed around Taylor and those who supported his former soldier with the National Patriotic Front of Liberia, Prince Johnson. Johnson took the capital Monrovia in 1990 and executed Doe, while Taylor's forces, the Armed Forces of Liberia, and Johnson's forces battled for control of Monrovia. Peace negotiations and foreign involvement led to a ceasefire in 1995 that was broken the next year before a final peace agreement and new national elections were held in 1997. Taylor was elected President of Liberia in July 1997. Background: Samuel Doe takes power in coup. Samuel Doe had taken power in a popular coup in 1980 against William R. Tolbert, becoming the first Liberian president of non-Americo-Liberian descent. Doe established a military regime called the People's Redemption Council and enjoyed early support from a large number of indigenous Liberian tribes who had been excluded from power since the founding of the country in 1847 by freed American slaves. Any hope that Doe would improve the way Liberia was run was put aside as he quickly clamped down on opposition, fueled by his paranoia of a counter-coup attempt against him. As promised, Doe held elections in 1985 and won the presidency by just enough of a margin to avoid a runoff. However, international monitors condemned this election as fraudulent. Coup attempt by Thomas Kalunkpa, the former commanding general of the Armed Forces of Liberia who Doe had demoted and forced to flee the country, attempted to overthrow Doe's regime from neighboring Sierra Leone. The coup attempt failed and Kalunkpa was killed at Eton. His body was publicly exhibited on the grounds of the Executive Mansion in Monrovia soon after his death. Crackdown on the Jayo and Mano tribes. Large-scale government crackdowns followed in Nimba County in the north of the country against the Jayo and Mano tribes where the majority of the coup plotters come from. The mistreatment of the Jayo and Mano tribes fueled ethnic tensions in Liberia, which had already been rising due to Doe's preferential treatment of his own group, the Kran. Charles Taylor builds insurgent forces. Charles Taylor, who had left Doe's government after being accused of embezzlement, assembled a group of rebels in Côte who later became known as the National Patriotic Front of Liberia. They invaded Nimba County on December 24, 1989. The Liberian army retaliated against the whole population of the region, attacking unarmed civilians and burning villages. Many left as refugees for Guinea and Côte, but opposition to Doe was inflamed. Prince Johnson, an NPFL fighter, split to form his own guerrilla force soon after crossing the border, based on the Jayo tribe and named Independent National Patriotic Front of Liberia. First Liberian Civil War. Charles Taylor's force attacks. Charles Taylor organized and trained indigenous Northerners in Ivory Coast. During Doe's regime, Taylor had served in the Liberian government's General Services Agency, acting as its de facto director. He fled to the United States in 1983 amid what Stephen Ellis describes as the increasingly menacing atmosphere in Monrovia shortly before Thomas Kalunkpa, Doe's chief lieutenant, fled into exile himself. Doe requested Taylor's extradition for embezzling $900,000 of Liberian government funds. Taylor was thus arrested in the United States and after 16 months broke out of a Massachusetts jail in circumstances that are still unclear. On December 24, 1989, Charles Taylor and a small group of Libyan-trained rebels calling themselves the National Patriotic Front of Liberia entered Nimba County from neighboring Côte, attacking the village of Butu. The raid, mounted by a small group of men, managed to capture some weapons, and then the raiders withdrew to the jungle. Kran vs. Jayo and Mano tribes. The NPFL initially encountered plenty of support within Nimba County, which had endured the majority of Samuel Doe unregistered trademark S wrath after the 1985 attempted coup. When Taylor and his force of 100 rebels re-entered Liberia in 1989, on Christmas Eve, thousands of Jayo and Mano joined them. While these formed the core of his rebel army, there were many Liberians of other ethnic backgrounds who joined as well. Doe responded by sending 2 AFL battalions, including the 1st Infantry Battalion, to Nimba in December 1989–January 1990, apparently under then-Colonel Hezekiah Bowen. The AFL acted in a very brutal and scorched-earth fashion which quickly alienated the local people. The rebel invasion soon pitted ethnic Kran sympathetic to the Doe regime against those victimized by it, the Jayo and the Mano. Thousands of civilians were massacred on both sides. Hundreds of thousands fled their homes. By May 1990 the AFL had been forced back to Gbanga, still under the control of Bowen's troops, but they lost the town to an NPFL assault on May 28. By June 1990, Taylor's forces were laying siege to Monrovia. In July 1990, Prince Yomi Johnson split from Taylor and formed the Independent National Patriotic Front. The INPFL and NPFL continued their siege on Monrovia, which the AFL defended. Johnson quickly took control of parts of Monrovia, prompting evacuation of foreign nationals and diplomats by the U.S. Navy in August. ECOWAS Intervention Force. In August 1990, the 16-member ECOWAS agreed to deploy a joint military intervention force, the Economic Community Monitoring Group, and place it under Nigerian leadership. The mission later included troops from non-ECOWAS countries, including Uganda and Tanzania. ECOWAS unregistered trademark S objectives were to impose a ceasefire, help Liberians establish an interim government until elections could be held, stop the killing of innocent civilians, and ensure the safe evacuation of foreign nationals. ECOWAS also sought to prevent the conflict from spreading into neighboring states, which share a complex history of state, economic, and ethno-linguistic social relations with Liberia. The Economic Community of West African States attempted to persuade Doe to resign and go into exile, but despite his weak position besieged in his mansion he refused. ECOWAS, an ECOWAS intervention force, arrived at the free port of Monrovia on August 24, 1990, landing from Nigerian and Ghanaian vessels. Capture and killing of Samuel Doe. On September 9, 1990, Doe visited the barely established, newly arrived ECOWAS headquarters in the free port of Monrovia. Stephen Ellis says, his motive was to lay a complaint that the ECOWAS commander had not paid a courtesy call to Doe, the head of state. However, the exact circumstances that led to Doe unregistered trademark S visit to the free port are still unclear. Doe had been under pressure to accept exile outside of Liberia. However, after Doe arrived, a large rebel force led by Prince John Sauna unregistered trademark SINPFL arrived at the headquarters and then attacked Doe's party. Doe was captured and taken to the INPFL unregistered trademark S Caldwell base. He was brutally tortured before being killed and dismembered. His torture and execution was videotaped by his captors. John Sauna unregistered trademark SINPFL and Tylora unregistered trademark SNPFL continued to struggle for control of Monrovia in the months that followed. With military discipline absent and bloodshed throughout the capital region, members of ECOWAS created the Economic Community Monitoring Group to restore order. The force comprised some 4,000 troops from Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, the Gambia and Guinea. ECOWAS succeeded in bringing Taylor and Johnson to agree to its intervention, but Taylor's forces engaged it in the port area of Monrovia. Peacemaking attempts. A series of peacemaking conferences in regional capitals followed. There were meetings in Bamako in November 1990, Lome in January 1991, and Yamoussoukro in June–October 1991. But the first 7 peace conferences, including the Yamoussoukro I-4 processes, failed. In November 1990, ECOWAS invited the principal Liberian players to meet in Banjul, Gambia to form a government of national unity. The negotiated settlement established the Interim Government of National Unity, led by Dr. Amos Sawyer, leader of the LPP. Bishop Ronald Diggs of the Liberian Council of Churches became vice president. However, Taylor's NPFL refused to attend the conference. Within days, hostilities resumed. ECOWAS was reinforced in order to protect the interim government. Sawyer was able to establish his authority over most of Monrovia, but the rest of Liberia was in the hands of various factions of the NPFL or of local gangs. ULIMO, the United Liberation Movement of Liberia for Democracy, was formed in June 1991 by supporters of the late President Samuel Kado and former armed forces of Liberia fighters who had taken refuge in Guinea and Sierra Leone. It was led by Raleigh Siki, a deputy minister of finance in the Doe government. After fighting alongside the Sierra Leonean army against the Revolutionary United Front, ULIMO forces entered western Liberia in September 1991. The group scored significant gains in areas held by another rebel group, the National Patriotic Front of Liberia, notably around the diamond mining areas of Lofa and Bomi counties. From its outset, ULIMO was beset with internal divisions and the group effectively broke into two separate militias in 1994, ULIMO-J, an ethnic Kran faction led by General Roosevelt Johnson, and ULIMO-K, a Mandingo-based faction led by Alhaji G.V. Nkrumah. The group was alleged to have committed serious violations of human rights, both before and after its breakup. Attack on Monrovia, peace was still far off as both Taylor and Johnson claimed power. ECOWAS declared an interim government of national unity with Amos Sawyer as their president, with the broad support of Johnson. Taylor launched an assault on Monrovia on October 15, 1992, named Operation Octopus. The assault may have been led by Burkina Faso soldiers. The resulting siege lasted 2 months. By late December, ECOWAS had pushed the NPFL back beyond Monrovia's suburbs. UNAMIL. In 1993, ECOWAS brokered a peace agreement in Côte, Benin. Following this, on September 22, 1993, the United Nations Security Council established the UN Observer Mission in Liberia, to support ECOWAS in implementing this Côte peace agreement. UNAMIL in early 1994 deployed 368 military observers and associated civilian personnel to monitor implementation of the abortive Côte peace agreement, prior to elections originally planned for February-March 1994. Renewed armed hostilities broke out in May 1994 and continued, becoming especially intense in July and August. ECOWAS, and later UNAMIL, members were captured and held hostage by some factions. By mid-1994, the humanitarian situation had become disastrous, with 1.8 million Liberians in need of humanitarian assistance. Conditions continued to deteriorate, but humanitarian agencies were unable to reach many in need due to hostilities and general insecurity. Factional leaders agreed in September 1994 to the Akosombo Agreement, a supplement to the Cotonou Agreement, named after the Ghanaian town where it was signed. The security situation in Liberia remained poor. In October 1994, in the face of ECOWAS funding shortfalls and a lack of will by the Liberian combatants to honor agreements to end the war, the UN Security Council reduced to about 90 the number of UNAMIL observers. It extended UNAMIL unregistered trademark S mandate and subsequently extended it several times until September 1997. In December 1994, the factions and other parties signed the Accra Agreement, a supplement to the Akosombo Agreement. Disagreements ensued and fighting continued. Ceasefire. In August 1995, the main factions signed an agreement largely brokered by Ghanaian President Jerry Rawlings. At a conference sponsored by ECOWAS, the United Nations and the United States, the European Union, and the Organization of African Unity, Charles Taylor agreed to a ceasefire and a timetable to demobilize and disarm his troops. At the beginning of September 1995, Liberia unregistered trademark S3 principal warlords Taylor, George Bowley and Alhaji Krumahara made theatrical entrances into Monrovia. A ruling council of 6 members under civilian Wilton G.S. Sankawulo and with the 3 factional heads Charles Taylor, Alhaji Krumah and George Bowley, took control of the country preparatory to elections that were originally scheduled for 1996. Fighting in Monrovia, heavy fighting broke out again in April 1996. This led to the evacuation of most international non-governmental organizations and the destruction of much of Monrovia. In August 1996, these battles were ended by the Abuja Accord in Nigeria, agreeing to disarmament and demobilization by 1997 and elections in July of that year. September 3, 1996, Sankawulo is followed by Ruth Perry as chairwoman of the ruling council, who served until August 2, 1997. 1997 elections, simultaneous elections for the presidency and National Assembly were finally held in July 1997. In a climate hardly conducive to free movement and security of persons, Taylor and his National Patriotic Party won an overwhelming victory against 12 other candidates. Assisted by widespread intimidation, Taylor took 75% of the presidential poll while the NPP won a similar proportion of seats in both parliamentary chambers. August 2, 1997, Ruth Perry handed power to elected President Charles Taylor. Aftermath: Liberians had voted for Taylor in the hope that he would end the bloodshed. The bloodshed did slow considerably, but it did not end. Violent events flared up regularly after the putative end of the war. Taylor, furthermore, was accused of backing guerrillas in neighboring countries and funneling diamond monies into arms purchases for the rebel armies he supported, and into luxuries for himself. After Taylor's victory, Liberia was peaceful enough so that refugees began to return. But other leaders were forced to leave the country, and some ULIMO forces reformed as the Liberians United for Reconciliation and Democracy. LURD began fighting in Lofa County with the aim of destabilizing the government and gaining control of the local diamond fields, leading to the Second Liberian Civil War. In 1997, the Liberian people elected Charles Taylor as the president after he entered the capital city, Monrovia, by force. The implicit unrest manifested during the late 1990s is emblematic in the sharp national economic decline and the prevalent sale of diamonds and timber in exchange for small arms. Impact: the 1989–1996 Liberian Civil War, which was one of Africa's bloodiest, claimed the lives of more than 200,000 Liberians and further displaced 1 million others into refugee camps in neighboring countries. Entire villages were emptied as people fled. Child soldiers committed atrocities, raping and murdering people of all ages. Liberia's civil war claimed the lives of 1 out of every 17 people in the country, uprooted most of the rest, and destroyed a once viable economic infrastructure. The strife also spread to Liberia's neighbors, contributing to a slowing of the democratization that was progressing steadily through West Africa at the beginning of the 1990s and destabilizing a region that already was one of the world's most marginal. Second Liberian Civil War: the Second Liberian Civil War began in 1999 and ended in October 2003, when ECOWAS intervened to stop the rebel siege on Monrovia and exile Charles Taylor to Nigeria until he was arrested in 2006 and taken to The Hague for his trial. By the conclusion of the final war, more than 250,000 people had been killed and nearly 1 million displaced. Half that number remained to be repatriated in 2005, at the election of Liberia's first democratic president since the initial 1980 coup d'état copyright of Samuel Doe. The incumbent Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who initially was a strong supporter of Charles Taylor, was inaugurated in January 2006 and the National Transitional Government of Liberia terminated its power. Lists: armed groups that participated in the war: Armed Forces of Liberia, Liberia Peace Council, Lofa Defense Force, National Patriotic Front of Liberia, Independent National Patriotic Front of Liberia, National Patriotic Front of Liberia Central Revolutionary Council. United Liberation Movement of Liberia for Democracy, United Liberation Movement of Liberia for Democracy Johnson Faction, United Liberation Movement of Liberia for Democracy Kroma faction. Peace agreements signed included the Banjul III Agreement, Bamako Ceasefire Agreement, Banjul IV Agreement, Loma Copyright Agreement, Yamoussoukro IV Peace Agreement, Geneva Agreement 1992, Cotonou Peace Agreement, ECOWAS Peace Agreement, Accra Agreements, ECOWAS Clarification Agreement, Abuja Peace Agreement. See also, Second Liberian Civil War, General, History of Liberia, References. Further reading, Gerds, Felix, Civil War and State Formation, The Political Economy of War and Peace in Liberia, Frankfurt, New York, Campus Verlag and University of Chicago Press, 2013, Huband, Mark. The Liberian Civil War. Frank Cass. ISBN 0-7146-4340-8, Moran, Mary H. Liberia, The Violence of Democracy, University of Pennsylvania Press, 2008, Hoffman, Danny. The City as Barracks, Freetown, Monrovia, and the Organization of Violence in Post-Colonial African Cities. Cultural Anthropology. Volume 22, number August 3, 2007, ppA 400-428. External links: The Liberian Peace Process Accord magazine online issue with articles, chronology and text of agreements, http www.Cr Accord Index php, Peace Process During Civil War, website includes photos from Liberian Civil War.